Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the QUT Faculty of Law, to our symposium on copyright law and the creative industries. The purpose of this event is to bring together creative practitioners, cultural, institutional representatives and legal academics and lawyers to discuss the intersection between copyright law, creativity and culture. As is always the case at QUT, in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning. We wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. My presentation today is on open GLAM, copyright law, 3D printing and cultural heritage. My name is Professor Matthew Rimmer. I do work on intellectual property and innovation law at QUT. I've been doing a project for the last few years on intellectual property and 3D printing. When I started out that project, I initially first looked at some of the issues around copyright law and cultural institutions in the context of 3D printing. So I wrote this kind of provisional early piece called 3D Printing Jurassic Park, and it examined how libraries and museums and galleries and cultural institutions made use of 3D printing. More recently, I've been doing fieldwork as part of that research, and really today I'd like to talk about some of that fieldwork, looking particularly in some European institutions about how 3D printing and additive manufacturing has been used and adopted to achieve all sorts of different effects in cultural institutions. To begin the talk, I'd really like to kind of start with a paper by Professor Sonia Catchell, formerly of Fordham Law School, now the University of California, Berkeley Law School, in which he kind of talked about techno-heritage and some of the applications of 3D printing. This 2017 paper noted that at the same time that cultural properties are facing destruction from war and environmental change, we're also living in an age of unprecedented interactivity and reproduction. Everywhere, museums are offering their collections for open access, 3D printing, and new projects involving virtual and augmented reality. With the advent of other sophisticated forms of digital technology, the preservation and replication of antiquities have never been easier. She kind of goes on and says, just as technology has the power to preserve and protect ancient artefacts, it also invites a dizzying array of legal conflicts over their digitalisation and replication, particularly with regards to the intersection of copyright law with cultural identity. And in this context, there's been a lot of discussion about the use of Creative Commons licenses to make cultural work open and accessible. There are a wide variety of different forms of Creative Commons standard terms. Some relate to the requirement for there to be attribution. Some have provisions in relation to non-commercial use. Some have provisions in relation to share alike in terms of the applications. And sometimes there's even uses in relation to non-derivative licenses. The Creative Commons movement has also been useful in the sense that it has also creative public domain dedication licenses to allow works to be dedicated to the public domain if need be. And with many of these new developments, you kind of see the use of Creative Commons licenses to overcome some of the barriers and obstacles that sometimes exist around copyright law and cultural materials. So in my talk today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Open GLAM movement, look at some of the innovations of libraries, galleries, archives and museums, and then finish up talking about the Free Basel project. At the Creative Commons Summit last week, Michael Weinberg gave a really interesting presentation upon the Open GLAM movement and its use of Creative Commons licenses. So Michael Weinberg has had various different roles in the past. He worked for a long while for Public Knowledge as a policy officer and did a number of white papers on the impact of intellectual property on 3D printing, like what's the deal with copyright and 3D printing. It'll be awesome if they don't screw it up. 3D printing intellectual property in the fight over the next great disruptive technology. Michael Weinberg then moved to the 3D printing company Shapeways and kind of did some interesting policy work on some of the legal issues around 3D scanning. He has now kind of moved to New York University, to the Engelberg Centre on Innovation, Law and Policy. And his latest project is the Open GLAM project. And really it was created in 2020 by the Sketchfab Cultural Heritage Lead, Thomas Flynn, Michael Weinberg, his fellow Neil Stimler, in consultation with a wide variety of 3D digitisation and open access experts from around the world. The ambition of the project is to try to assist a wide range of different cultural institutions in making the most of some of the technologies that are available, but also some of the forms of legal infrastructure that are available to help digitise collections, but also 3D print them, 3D scan them, and make them more accessible in various different ways. So glam3d.org says, digital and digitised cultural resources do not merely serve as archives and records, they exist as digital objects in and of themselves, as well as in a relationship with hardware and software environments that present and represent them to us. The greater aim is to make use of cultural resources in contemporary life for accessible, creative, commercial and learning purposes with a vital agency. They hope that digital cultural resources should enable and empower a broad spectrum of users, now and the future, to fashion new cultural production without undue burden or restrictions. Open access is a baseline requirement when creating born digital and digitised content in the 21st century. And they kind of note that there are different copyright considerations depending upon subject matter. So certain sorts of material, like say natural specimens like plants, insects or fossils, are not going to be protected as copyrightable subject matter. Functional items are not going to be protected as copyrightable subject matter. Machines or mechanical items are not going to be protected by copyright law. There's going to be an array of material and cultural institutions that will already be in the public domain. They do note, though, that traditional copyright works like literary works, artistic works, dramatic works, musical works, television and film broadcasts, and cinematographic films will be subject to copyright protection. In those circumstances, the copyright term plays a really important part, particularly for cultural institutions. The term of protection is life plus 70 years in the United States and Australia and the European Union. There are some other countries who still only have life plus 50 years, but the term of protection is very long. Once a work reaches the end of its copyright term, it then enters the public domain. And public domain status is really important for both the digitising institution and the public. In other circumstances, one really has to rely upon licensing. And the Creative Commons licensing is particularly useful in relation to copyrighted works. It's best practice for digitising institutions to license all metadata and descriptions using the CC0 license. Other permissive licensing structures, such as the attribution requirement of a Creative Commons license, can create unintended challenges for downstream users of metadata and descriptions. and metadata descriptions will often be used in large-scale analysis or other data-driven investigations. Determining the proper way to comply with that seemingly straightforward attribution requirement can present some disproportionate challenges. So I think that provides a really useful framework for some of the case studies that I'm now going to mention. It kind of provides a useful infrastructure for grappling with some of these issues and some of these questions. Over my career, I've kind of looked on many occasions at some of the copyright issues facing libraries. There have been kind of classic disputes in Australia and Canada, the United States and elsewhere, in which publishers and authors have brought actions against libraries for copyright infringement, and that has raised interesting questions over inventory liability. Digitalisation and the development of 3D printing has also kind of presented some new opportunities for libraries. So during my fieldwork, I visited Amsterdam, and the OBA, the Amsterdam Central Library, has been very innovative in terms of the ways in which it's tried to reinvent the library space. So amongst other things, it has a range of different collections in its central location, but it has some different sorts of spaces as well. And it was very striking to me that they had embedded in the OBA both a maker space and a kids maker space. So the institution, as well as kind of offering all sorts of additional things to borrow and loan, has also set up as part of its site MakerPlatz 21, which is really a network of maker spaces embedded in libraries throughout Amsterdam, and the users can collaborate and cooperate with one another and connect with one another. And I think it's a really interesting way of reimagining the library, of transforming the library. And very noticeable at the library was the Maker's Bill of Rights as a kind of a manifesto about the maker movement in the Netherlands. And in addition to the makerspace design for adults, there was a very kind of noticeable makerspace design for kids and students. And I guess a very kind of important aspect of that network model has been encouraging kids and children, students, to learn about new things through making. So there's a really interesting notion of 3D printing being part of an educational strategy with a pedagogical approach around it. The strategy has also been boosted by collaboration with the local Fab Lab. So Amsterdam has WAG, which was one of the earliest Fab Labs. It has since diversified into a whole cluster of different specialist laboratories. But it has played a very kind of useful role in training and educating teachers and librarians about some of the applications and uses of 3D printing and the maker movement. So that has been a really interesting case study to look at, much like our own very progressive state library in Queensland. The OBA in Amsterdam has used its makerspace to form connections with all sorts of different communities and groups. And in addition, it has sought to engage in the education and training of kids. And I think it's kind of functioned in a very kind of inclusive fashion in trying to ensure that all members of the Dutch community had access to a wide range of new technologies. Another case study that I looked at was really focusing upon galleries. I went to Vienna in Austria and visited the Belvedere Museum, the very ornate and elaborate kind of site for the remnants of the Austrian Hungarian Empire. In pride of place is Gustav Klimt's work, The Kiss, And, you know, hordes of visitors and gallery goers and tourists went and saw this particular beautiful artwork. And in the social media age, also had their photos taken next to the artwork. But what I was particularly interested in was the tactile version of the painting, which you can see in this picture that I took just next to the Klimt painting. So essentially a 3D tactile version of the artwork had been created. So if one had a visual disability, one could feel the surface of the tactile version of the painting and understand its textures and its elements in a very profound way. So it's kind of a really striking example of using new technologies to make artistic works more accessible, particularly for those who have visual disabilities. And after kind of seeing this work in person, I kind of followed up and visited a kind of a key tech centre in Vienna in Austria, just next to the United Nations Tech Gate. And I interviewed Andreas Reichinger, who used 3D printing and CNC milling and a variety of other technologies to develop these amazing tactile artworks, both for the Belvedere Museum, but a range of other institutions as well. It involved great artistry in terms of trying to replicate those artworks, but it also meant that they had to kind of carefully utilise an array of different technologies as well to realise those works. But I thought it was a really kind of powerful example of those sorts of technologies being used to boost disability rights. And in copyright law, we've had some very big debates of late in terms of copyright law and disability discrimination. Notably, the Marrakesh Treaty recognised that there should be a wide array of exceptions and flexibilities to provide access to communities with disabilities to cultural works. But I think this particular example is a really interesting instance of using new technologies to make work much more accessible. We've also had some interesting kind of issues arise in relation to archives and museums. So the News Museum in Berlin, which I briefly visited, has been the subject of some controversy after they tried to claim copyright over a Nefertiti bust. And as Michael Weinberg kind of noted, this was a very controversial assertion of copyright. They tried to kind of make it subject to a Creative Commons license, but that kind of presupposes that the work is subject to copyright protection. And as Michael Weinberg has noted, the work is really based upon a scan of a 3,000-year-old sculpture. So copyright should have long expired. And moreover, the original creator of the work is not listed as the kind of copyright holder. So I think there's a kind of an interesting question here about a cultural institution trying to claim copyright protection over a work that has fallen into the public domain. And while there are some interesting questions about, you know, can you have copyright in a scan over a public domain work, I think the best position is that that work itself should be subject to being in the public domain. So Michael Weinberg has kind of highlighted that there's really a larger problem here, and there's a kind of a danger of copy fraud in the sense of the institution falsely claiming that they have copyright control over a work that is in fact in the public domain. In respect of museums, there's been a lot of debate about repatriation of cultural heritage. Jeffrey Robertson, in his recent book, Who Owns History, kind of made the point that with new technologies like 3D scanners and 3D printers, there should be less need for institutions like the British Museum to hold on to original artefacts and works like the erroneously called Elgin marbles. I think one of the really interesting works to appear in relation to museums has been the Scan the World project, which has since 2014 scanned over 16,000 objects, involved over 1,500 artists and 803 places. This project has involved doing 3D scans of famous cultural works and making them available to be 3D printed. And indeed, these works themselves have been featured in the Victorian Albert Museum. So Jonathan Beck has written a really interesting piece about his project in the Site magazine called Disruptive Devices, Digital Artefacts and Digital Cultural Artefacts. And he has kind of talked about that project. But he has kind of noted that the traditional approaches many museums take to their digital collections have in recent times raised concerns about ownership, repatriation, sharing and identity. And he's kind of concerned that there's been some very extortionate costs in terms of getting permissions for the reproduction of digital images. So he would like to democratise digital collections with the Scan the World project. And in developing Scan the World, he believes that every object tells a story and that an object on Scan the World shouldn't be bound to one owner or one narrative. So it's a fascinating project, and they've been really trying to push for digital archives being made widely accessible with the appropriate metadata and accreditation, and allowing for a renewed sense of shared knowledge, heritage and creativity. So I think that's kind of a fascinating project. And he notes as word of these 3D technologies starts to settle in the GLAM sector museums, we hope we'll be able to consider the benefits of opening their digitised collections to the world from a new perspective, and encourage knowledge to be disseminated by people and to bring that narrative to the masses. I just want to finish up my talk by talking about the Free Basel project. I heard about this project when I was visiting the Creative Commons Global Summit in 2018. There was a very notable leader of a Syrian project which was designed to digitise cultural heritage that was being badly affected by some of the conflicts within Syria. Basil Carterbill went missing during the conflict, and at the 2018 summit we heard that he had in fact been picked up by the Syrian authorities and summarily executed without proper processes of justice. So to kind of commemorate his contribution to open knowledge, the Free Palmyra project has created scans of sites of cultural heritage in Syria, and they used a mega 3D printer to kind of create these huge plinths in miniature form, which were then kind of exhibited at the Creative Commons Summit. And moreover, there has been a kind of a fund set up to help commemorate the work of Basil Carterbill coming out of that particular project. So I think the Free Palmyra project is a really interesting project which has been designed to help provide some sort of record of cultural heritage which has been affected by a military conflict. And I think it kind of shows the way that 3D printing and 3D scanning and projects like Scan the World and the Open GLAM project can be used to preserve cultural heritage and communicate cultural heritage to the wider world, and even keep a record of cultural heritage when it's been otherwise destroyed by military conflict or some other disaster. Thank you.